Good evening, Mayor and Council. My name is Emilio Ramirez. I am Housing Director here at the City of Oxnard. We are pleased to be before you again in your consideration of two draft ordinances, one for rent stabilization and the other one for just cause eviction and tenant protection. Um, as you already know, the state of California enacted the Tenant Protection Act in 2019. That act did provide for rent stabilization controls or rent controls, and also for tenant protection in the similar effort of just cause evictions. That state law did not provide for a local enforcement. In previous presentations, one on September 14th to the Community Services and Public Safety and Housing Development Committee, and the other to City Council on October 19th, staff presented the history of why we are in front of you for your consideration of these two ordinances, heard a lot of comment regarding those potential strategies, and the City Council directed that staff present draft tenant protection and rent stabilization ordinances to the City Council within January. So we are here before you today per that direction. The City Council directed that staff consider ordinances that would do the following, that would provide tenant protections for both just cause and no cause evictions, including relocation benefits that would be compatible to the 1 month equivalent that's in the Tenant Protection Act, as well as an annual rent adjustment of not more than 5%, which would set to expire in December 2030. Provide for local enforcement, which was a significant consideration, and offer education and program for landlords and tenants of all of the rights and obligations in each of the two ordinances. Staff in drafting the ordinances reviewed 38 different local programs and focused in on 5 cities that have local efforts: Sacramento, Santa Ana, San Jose, Santa Cruz, and Concord. And we modeled the draft ordinances by a combination of those efforts. Ultimately, we engaged Best and Krieger law firm to help us to finalize the drafts that are in front of you today. So they took the city staff effort and made it into the draft that you're considering today. So the first is the rent stabilization, and the rent stabilization ordinance includes the following significant points. Others that we're asking for your review, but that rent control regulation applies to the same same residential rental units as described in the State Tenant Protection Act, and as they are allowed to be applied by the Costa-Hawkins Act, namely rentals in apartment complexes that are more than 15 years old. It limits the annual rent increases to not more than once per year and not more than 5% per year. It allows the base rent to be set after turnover, or for that matter, in other words, does not allow vacancy control, also a provision of Costa-Hawkins. It requires the written notice of the rent increase. It allows the landlord to appeal the rental increase limitation based on a claim of fair rate of return, and imposes a rent stabilization fee to cover the cost of implementing the program. This ordinance does sunset December 2030 per the direction of council in October. Then the just cause eviction and tenant protection ordinance, which is a separate effort. It includes the following provisions. Number one, for a no-fault termination, it requires the payment of a relocation benefit similar to the Tenant Protection Act. In this case, the greater of 1 month's rent or $2,500. It requires a written notice for a no-fault termination, including the disclosure of relocation benefits, and imposes a tenant protection program fee to cover the cost of implementing this program. Also sunsets in December 2030, but we're asking council for specific direction as to whether or not you'd like to see this ordinance sunset at the same time as the rent stabilization ordinance. Enforcement at a local level was a significant motivation. behind the council's direction to enact a local ordinance. And so we are working on creating a local enforcement program. First, we think that that program, together with the education campaign, which I'll talk about in a little bit, could potentially have an annual cost of 1.2 million. This is after it's fully burdened and at full operation, which we don't think will happen immediately, but will ramp up over time. And at fully burdened, we're thinking that we would need 6 staff positions, including a program manager, office support staff, fiscal support staff, compliance officer, that hearing officer, and staff in the city attorney's office, deputy city attorney or paralegal. We are looking at a complaint-based enforcement system, and we are going to be seeking the council to establish both per unit fees for the tenant protection as well as the rent stabilization ordinances. The council directed that staff, we can produce a program for education and training of the rights and obligations of the landlords. And we are looking at that program. Obviously, we are not able to actually put together the program until we know the final draft of the ordinances. But we think that they will minimally include the 5 items that are on screen now. We do think that there's a possibility that we will RFP this out for it to be on a contract basis with an outside body. But we do think that we are going to need to offer a bilingual program for delivery to make sure that everybody knows that the 2 ordinances exist, for tenants to be able to be aware of their rights, and for landlords to be aware of their rights, and each of them to be aware of their obligations. Printed and electronic materials that we would produce, we have seen a couple of examples that are out there that we'd like. We are going to do an outreach effort, going to meetings, tenant groups and landlord groups, describing the various provisions of each of the two ordinances. Produce a web presence. There are some that we like. In Sacramento, for example, has a good website that we think is something that we could try to copy. Social media campaign, obviously, in pursuing the education of what the 2 programs would require. Financial impact, like I said, we think that the program, both for enforcement and education, at fully burdened, is approximately $1.2 million. We don't think it's going to be immediate, but it's going to ramp up to this level over time. Each ordinance does include an imposition of an annual fee, which we'll ask the council to consider separately, but those fees would go to paying for that cost of 1.2 million, and also any of the other fees and penalties in violation of the ordinances would also contribute to the cost of running the programs. So staff is asking the council to consider and review the 2 ordinances that are before you today, provide direction to staff for any modifications to the draft ordinances. We will then bring them back for final consideration and adoption. There are some very specific things that we are asking the council to look at. One of them is whether or not the tenant protection ordinance or the just cause eviction tenant protection ordinance should sunset in 2030 along with the rent stabilization ordinance. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.